Go for it. So I have been tasked with doing this last little part here, and this is actually literally one that was mentioned earlier on, that's happening this week. That is happening, and so I had to revise my notes as of this week based off of the presentation for this on Catholicism and sexuality. From a historical position, homosexuality was viewed as sinful and as a perversion of God's original design and plan for mankind. Going back to early church fathers, John Chrysostom says this: all these affections, homosexual acts, are condemned by the laws, but passion is in itself a good thing, implanted in us by God for many purposes. But this passion is more vehement than the rest, and if it be not governed with due prudence, it is apt to lead to the most grievous sins. We're talking about early church fathers that are claimed within Catholicism, and the rest were very clear early on about this, including Augustine of Hippo. Those offenses which be contrary to nature are everywhere and at all times to be held in detestation and punished. Such were those of the Sodomites, which should all nations commit. They should all be held guilty of the same crime by the divine law, which hath not so made men that they should be in that way abuse one another. This is back in the 350s, so early ages of the church. In the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas said, therefore, since inordinate venereal acts, that is, venereal acts other than those required for the purpose of procreation, are species of lust, it follows that simple fornication, which is committed without injury to another person, is the least grave among the species of lust. Now, among sins against nature, the lowest is simple fornication. St. Bonaventure noted, certain of the passions of the soul and of the body are unnatural when they proceed from some defect in nature, as it is to be seen in a woman having connection with a beast, or a man with another man. Then you get it to Peter Canisius. Every unchaste act is a sin against nature, but sins which are contrary to nature or against nature, such as are those which occur between males, are the most detestable, for they are directly contrary to nature. Robert Bellarmine, homosexual acts as well as any sexual act outside of marriage between one man and one woman are contrary to the natural law and the divine law. So just quickly here, we've gone from the ancient world, the early fathers, the Middle Ages, and now into the post-Reformation era, Pope Pius V. Persons who have given themselves over to the vice of sodomy and against nature are to be handed over to the secular authorities for punishment. They are not to be reconciled with the church by the sacrament of penance until they have fulfilled the public penance imposed upon them. So you're seeing over and over again, all the way up until 1986 in these times. This was from the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith. Although the particular inclination of the homosexual person is not a sin, it is more or less tendency ordered towards an intrinsic moral evil. So here you're starting to see some change in some terminologies where they're saying, look, having these feelings is not inherently sinful, but acting upon them leads to the moral evil. Catechism of the Catholic Church in 1992, basing itself on sacred scripture, which presents homosexual acts as an act of grave depravity, tradition has always declared that homosexual acts are intrinsically disordered. They are contrary to the natural law. They close the sexual act to the gift of life. They do not proceed from a genuine, effective, and sexual complementarity. Under no circumstances can they be approved. Then you have, most recently, Pope John Paul II, and the discussion which followed the publication of the Declaration of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith on the question of homosexuality. Some people feared, as if by way of retroactive effect, a revision of the Church's doctrine on the question. This declaration does not seem to favor any change in this regard and should not be used to justify contrary positions. So you're seeing all the way up until just the last really 20 years, because this is all the way up until 2005, these were the positions. Now, if you know what was going on in culture at that time, well, quite a bit has shifted from there. In fact, this is where suddenly, and I would argue it's happened over the last 20 years, but in the last 5 to 8 years, really since 2013, since Pope Francis, there has been a shift even more so in the discussions on this issue. So Pope Francis I, this is what was said in a documentary film titled Francesco, released in 2020. Pope Francis expressed support for civil unions for same-sex couples, stating homosexual people have a right to be in a family, they're children of God, and have a right to a family. Now, this is very different than the historical position of the Catholic Church over the last 2,000 years. He also said, if they, gay priests, accept the Lord and have goodwill, who am I to judge them? They shouldn't be marginalized. The tendency, same-sex attraction, is not the problem. They're our brothers. So you're starting to see why, in the last 5 to 10 years, really a lot of Catholics are going, what's happening here right now? Because it feels like we've had a very strong teaching on this for 2,000 years, and there seems to be a shift that is happening in the conversations. During a meeting with a group of gay Catholics in 2018, Pope Francis reportedly told them, God loves all his children, however they are, you are children of God. Are you noticing the shift here? So, after these statements were made over the last few years, here are some headlines that started to show up across everywhere. Pope endorses same-sex civil unions in new documentary film. And in fact, in the media, this was celebrated in major ways. This was seen as a vindication of the change and the needed changes in time. Then the Pope clarifies his remarks about homosexuality right after that, and they have to kind of backtrack because he said, yes, but not, what I said was that they're loved by God and the rest, just like all people are loved by God, but I don't mean that they can act those things out. And so there was a clarification that had to be given, not from ex cathedra, not from the seat or the power of the throne, but as a man, he seems to have spoken in a documentary and then had to backtrack a little while later. But then there was the why the Pope's endorsement of same-sex unions matters. You might have seen back in December of earlier this year, there was a proclamation that was put forth that did actually shift, where Catholic priests are now able to bless same-sex unions, civil unions, as long as they're not viewed as actual marriage. As long as you know you're not actually married, because marriage is between a man and a woman before God, as long as you understand that, you can still be blessed. You can't do it in the robes, you can't do it with the sacraments, you can't do those things, but you can still bless individuals. And what I've found from a lot of my Catholic friends and the conversations I've had with a lot of Catholics in our community and the rest has been confusion. Because it seems like we're saying one thing and then doing another in a lot of ways. In fact, this was one of the articles that came out recently that I saw. As a married gay Catholic just blessed by a Catholic priest, I welcome the church's openness. This was the afternoon after the that it was put forth that suddenly that you could give same-sex union blessings. There were already Catholic priests ready to go, ready to officiate all of the things in their communities, and including having reporters and the rest ready to be there to write the articles, to have the photography, to do all the things that were there. From there, you see this Vatican decree on blessing same-sex couples gets mixed responses from bishops in Europe and Africa. And we kind of hinted at earlier that there has been a shift away from Europe to more progressive Western Christianity in Europe and the United States is finding a hard time finding roots in the more conservative South American and African Catholic dioceses. And so because they tend to be more conservative in the faith, and they still have lots of children, and abortion is not something that is venerated in the more Western cultures in the United States and Europe, it's more celebrated to have these things. They're more progressive in their minds when it comes to same-sex unions and the rest. The Pope approves blessings for same-sex couples that must not resemble marriage. That's my favorite tagline for an article. Because did you notice it says Pope approves blessings for same-sex couples that must not resemble marriage. So there can be a couple, but they can't be married in any way. The church does not recognize that. This is where so many of these contemporary concerns, concepts are coming about for our community right now. And as I noted, even this week, there was another document that I'll hint at here in a second that actually seems to have gone back a little bit on where they were just last year in December. Pope Francis calls for the inclusion of trans people in Catholic Church practices. And so this was a huge article that came out just a little while ago. Massive push for trans rights and the rest until, was it April 8th? So until 5 days ago, when the 5-year document that they've been working on came out and actually called gender theory as one of the gravest dangers to the church. So you have this progressive, it seems, Pope, at least in the way he speaks, the way he talks, the things that he's quoted as saying to individuals and the rest. And then you have the doctrines that are coming out in spite of him speaking that seem to cause a lot of this confusion. Here the Vatican says, and this is what it is, the Vatican says surrogacy and gender theory are grave threats to human dignity. So this just came out April 8th. And so now this 5-year document of this on dignity of humanity has now been published, and it goes and reverses, or it seemingly reverses, much of what the Pope has said. But now you're trying to balance December's article on, well, yes, you can bless same-sex unions, but now also gender theory and the rest is a grave concern and threat to the Catholic Church. And so much of what's going on, yes.
Can you explain what gender theory is?
So gender theory in and of itself is the current discussion that's happening in academia, it's happening in the world on transgenderism, whether there are more than two genders, more than just male or female, that there are, I think the current count, and I'm not meaning to mock, I think it's 92 is currently how many different, so polyamorous, amorous, poly, there's even things that to me sound made up, but they're not. Furries, that's a thing, where people who believe they're animals. And so there's lots of different concepts within gender theory, broadly speaking. This would also include puberty blockers. This would include transitioning children. This would include all of those different concepts within that. This is what the Catholic Church has come out and said, this is a grave danger. This is a grave threat to humanity, the dignity of humans. Now, you might think in December there was some celebration on part of same-sex couples going, this is the step forward, and soon enough, much like we have with the women's roles, much like we have with the abortion, I would think abortion is far more accepted, as noted. I think it's more than half of Catholics in the United States today accept abortion as a right, and that's something that would be good, even though that goes against Catholic doctrine. I think we're well on our way in the women's rights, and even more so with human sexuality and sexuality. That these cultural pressures and cultural push that's happening within Western Christianity and Western Catholicism is causing and will cause a fairly dynamic shift, if not another great schism. That's something Greg and I have talked about quite a bit. My father mentioned 1054 with a break from Eastern, basically Greek Orthodox, and then also the modern Catholicism, Roman Catholics that we have today. Where do those lines break? Where do they break away? And typically it's when major doctrines change. And that seems to be, especially with the current Pope, to be something where there at least has been some confusion has been caused in some of these arenas, not holding people responsible or accountable to the doctrines of Catholicism. Say abortion is a sin. If you're a practicing Catholic, that means that you should not be given communion, you should not have the rights of the church and the rest. If you're a practicing Catholic who provides and continues to administer for or desire abortion in the community. In the same way, it would seem that progressive rights such as human sexuality, gender theory, all of these different things, if you are pro these things after these documents are coming out from the Catholic Church, then you would also not be able to continue down that path. This is where I think the Great Schism is ultimately coming. And I'll close with this. This is a statement from a professor, Ulrich Linner at Notre Dame. The Vatican statement, and this is referencing December's statement, and then also the one that came out specifically about blessing same-sex unions, in my view, the most unfortunate public announcement in decades. Moreover, some bishops will use it as a pretext to do what the document explicitly forbids, especially since the Vatican has not stopped them before. It is, and I hate to say it, an invitation to schism. In fact, if you look at what happened, I noted just that article that even by the end of the day, when it was finally allowed, there was already articles going out of Catholic priests blessing same-sex unions. There were priests who were fired, who were demoted from their roles because they would not do those things, or they did see it as problematic, that the schisms within that had already happening. Now you add on top of this gender ideology and the rest, which within our culture is one of the most pervasive moves currently. It's attached itself with feminism, it's attached itself with progressivism, and because of that, all of this movement is going to find either a massive backlash, because the Catholic Church is going to have to withstand what it just put out this week as saying, this is a grave threat. And so do they hold the line, or as my father noted, and I appreciate him doing that, is what happens when the faithful leave the church? When the faithful leave good sound doctrine to progressive values or whatever they might find to be what they desire or what culture speaks in that moment. What does it take to break away from 2,000 years of history? Well, sometimes it's a cultural movement, which is what currently happened in the 1970s and 1960s with abortion. It's happening even more so now with feminism, even within the Catholic Church, and now also with sexuality along the way. So will they hold the line? I don't know. But there are those within the Catholic framework who are terribly worried about this and see this as the possibility of opening the door to another great schism that could cause a departure and a breaking away from the North to the South, in essence, the Western to the South and Central American to even the African church within the context of the Catholic Church. So that's